I have a very bad stomach and sickness about my heart, and great heat rising up through me, and sweating in my face, and at the butt of my throat always stifling me, all the trouble of the world in it, and very bound in the bowels, and a pain in my head, and I does always be inclined to discharge my stomach, and I never can, and I have often gripping, and a great bast in my lung, and I does be belching up every minute. This was the personal account of some unfortunate soul whose story made its way into the magazine, the Chicago Medical Examiner, in 1874. Now, I know 1874 is not the Middle Ages, but there are enough symptoms here that we can look at it through a medieval humoral lens. And his symptoms sound absolutely terrible. Stomachache and sickness around the heart, hot head and sweating in the face, a stifled throat, severe constipation, headache, the constant need to vomit but inability to do so, a gripping bast, whatever that is, in the lung, and belching every minute. And he, of course, had no idea his doctor would submit his condition to a medical journal, probably just as a curiosity, especially as he submitted it in the patient's own hand, complete with the original misspellings, almost as if to prove the patient was clearly an uneducated buffoon to be laughed at. And he submitted it under the understated title, "A Bad Case." Really, doctor, you don't say. And what did you do to treat it? That is conveniently missing. But this unfortunate man was far from alone. Heartburn is one of the most common complaints there is. And being one of the most common complaints throughout time, people have spent all of the time trying to treat it. Today we have antacids and proton pump inhibitors. In 1874, when this case is from, the treatments might have looked like bismuth subnitrate, which is essentially Pepto-Bismol, Nux vomica, mandrake extract, and potassium bromide. And we can speculate that that probably didn't help that much. And we can also speculate that this doctor really didn't have any interest in helping him because he thought the condition was more of a joke than anything else. And we really ultimately can't know whatever happened to this person. But what would earlier doctors have done before the decline of herbal medicine in Europe? Maybe not for this case specifically, but what would have been a potential treatment approach or understanding and formula for heartburn in general? Let's do some digging and see what we can find. But first, a quick note on the word itself. Heartburn obviously doesn't mean your heart is burning. Heartburn isn't some old and antiquated expression from a time when people didn't understand anatomy. We like to think that people from earlier times were kind of dumb, but they weren't. They did know what anatomy was. So the heart in heartburn doesn't mean your beating heart. It means the core. So heart in the sense of the core of something, like heartwood, heart rot, heart shake, all of these referring to wood. It's the heart of the matter, the heartland, the heart of the city, the heart of the forest, mountain, jungle, etc. So the heart in heartburn does not refer to an organ, it refers to a location, and that location is your core. So how does one treat this burning at the core? Well, that depends upon what you think is causing it. Medieval physicians specifically, and medieval people generally, did know that the pain came from the stomach. Again, they weren't dumb. There's the idea that medieval people didn't know what internal anatomy was, but you have to remember they butchered all of their own food. And they also would have seen plenty of gruesome injuries from various wars and accidents. So, of course, they had a general idea of what the organs of the body were, and of course, they would have a pretty good idea of what the stomach and esophagus was, and how those areas correlated to the pain they were feeling. And honestly, from their lived experience of butchering animals, it's fair to say that they had a much better idea of internal anatomy than most modern people do who don't actively study it. Ask any random person on the street today what side of the body the liver is on, where the pancreas is, if the gallbladder is above or below the liver, and they'll probably have a hard time answering you. So, if medieval physicians did know it was the stomach that was affected, what did they think was actually going on? In humoral medicine, heartburn, burning, is due to heat. That's pretty obvious. Something is causing the tissues to burn. The question is, what is that something? There were a number of different pathological patterns that could cause what we today call heartburn. The tissue itself can be hot. There can be too much yellow bile. There can be putrefaction, which is when a cold stomach doesn't cook the food properly and it rots and creates heat. And there can also be movement disorders, like there can be the upward movement of vapors, which we might think of as something like delayed gastric emptying, maybe with some fermentation in the stomach. And there can also be a lack of containment, which is the lower esophageal sphincter not closing. And these movement disorders don't really happen on their own, but accompany the other patterns. Now, all of these patterns deserve their own descriptions and explanations, treatment strategies, and herbal formula approaches. And if you want to see how humoral physicians would have approached these cases, sign up to my Substack, link is below. But here, we're just going to focus on the pattern of yellow bile. Yellow bile, one of the four humors, is acrid, biting, bitter, and hot. It shouldn't be in the stomach much at all, and if it is, then it causes problems. You'll see stomach-specific symptoms with too much yellow bile, like burning in the stomach or esophagus, thirst, bitter taste, belching of stomach acid, dry retching, and if it's really bad, vomiting of yellowish or greenish fluids, which are actually bile. All of these symptoms will be worse on an empty stomach, but also worse after rich foods. But this pattern doesn't just stay in the stomach. Heat travels throughout the body, so if the yellow bile is really bad and really hot, you might see smelly diarrhea with abdominal cramping, or if it gets worse, dry bowels because the whole thing is drying out. And you'd also see dryness of the mucous membranes of the mouth, throat, lips, etc. And also, you'll likely see irritability, agitation, insomnia, headaches, low-grade fever, flushed face, and a hot head. So putting this all together, what does this kind of person look like? Typically, they eat too much and or drink too much. They're always warm. And in the winter, they tend to wear a t-shirt. Their face is kind of always red, and they're always a little edgy. Now, what causes yellow bile in the stomach? As we hinted at earlier, generally it's from immoderate eating. Too much rich food, too much spicy food, too much alcohol, and a generally or constitutionally irritable disposition. And of course, illness can do this too. The humoral approach would be to give herbs that are classified as cold and wet, or cold and dry, depending upon the symptom presentation, because cold herbs are directly counteracting the heat of the yellow bile. So these are things like dandelion, violet, wormwood, gentians, or even purgatives like aloe and rhubarb root. And as a quick aside, I have to say, people say dandelion is a blood purifier. That's the generic description for it, and I see it so much that I have to make a comment here. What does it mean to purify the blood? What do we actually think blood purification is? What's wrong with the blood and what needs to be taken out of it? This is important because this means something specific in humoral medicine. But now it is more or less non-specific because it is mixed with modern ideas of toxicity. And this invariably comes back to the liver. And so the thinking goes, dandelion helps the liver detox by promoting bile flow and helping to clear metabolic waste. So this is what is meant by purifying the blood. Now, we can argue whether this perspective is actually entirely accurate, but what we can't argue with is that in humoral medicine, dandelion, being cold, purifies the blood specifically of yellow bile. And what that means is you have to have very specific symptoms of yellow bile in the blood in order to want to use it. And then we have to come to terms with the fact that the humoral concept of blood is not the modern concept of blood. So, what are we even talking about when we say blood? And at the end of the day, saying that dandelion purifies the blood is mixing metaphors. That's humoral language imported into a modern, non-humoral herbal system, which may still use humoral language at times, but is much more closely aligned with modern medicine and modern pharmacology, for better or for worse. And while you can argue that there is maybe an overlap, it also kind of doesn't make sense. And this kind of conflation loses key clinical signs and symptoms you want to see to use it, namely symptoms of yellow bile. Again, mixing metaphors with the danger of diluting both. So that aside out of the way, back to the particular heartburn pattern that we're looking at, which is the pattern of yellow bile. The yellow bile pattern of heartburn is a pretty simple syndrome, and therefore the formula that we're going to look at is itself pretty simple. But simple here doesn't mean ineffective or simplistic. Rather, it means very directed and undiluted. It has a clear focus. This formula wasn't trying to fix a complex condition of mixed hot and cold and wet and dry with herbs doing a bunch of different competing things. And because it wasn't, it could be simple, and because it could be simple, it could be very clear and intentional. The formula in question that we're going to look at is Oxysaccharum, and this is from the Antidotarium Nicolai. The Antidotarium Nicolai was an 11th to 12th century formulary written in Latin with about 150 formulas. It was written in Salerno, Italy at the Schola Medica Salernitana, which was the center of medical knowledge of the High Middle Ages. And this Antidotarium was itself based on the Antidotarium of Constantine the African, which itself was based on older Arabic works and was considered to be one of the most influential medical texts in medieval literature. You can find tons of copies online of the Antidotarium Nicolai, copies of out-of-print texts from the 1800s that are themselves reprints of the original Latin, Middle French, and even Dutch, but oddly nothing in English. Now, if you look at the Antidotarium, the first thing you'll notice is that it tells you absolutely nothing about how to actually use any of these formulas in it. It rarely even tells you what the formula is for. It was simply a recipe book, and you had to know what recipe was needed. And to know this, you would need to look at a practica first, not go directly to the Antidotarium. This meant you needed to know what you were doing, and you had to use the symptom complex to derive pathology and then match it to the correct treatment approach, and then finally match that to the correct formula. So this means that the humoral herbal medicine was not cookbook medicine of X symptom equals Y medicine. You really had to figure out what you needed to do. So let's take a look at our formula, and then we are going to try and make it. Now, I've already talked about this formula in the video on first pepsis and the cooking in the stomach. So if you've seen that, you can just skip ahead to where we are actually going to go ahead and make it. Our formula states, Oxysaccharum is so called from oxy, which means vinegar, and zucchero, which means sugar. It is useful in acute tertian fevers and not truly in quartans. It purges yellow bile present in the stomach. Take 1 pound of sugar, 8 ounces of the juice of pomegranates, and 4 ounces of vinegar. Place them over the fire in a tinned vessel and let it boil, constantly stirring with a spatula until it reaches the thickness of sugar so that it can be carried in a small box. It is given in the morning with warm water in a dose of 1.5 ounces. So what is this formula doing? Let's talk about that first, and then let's try and make it. And remember, when talking about Western pharmacology, I try and research the best I can, but some of this might end up being speculative because there's just not that much info out there. There's not a ton of research on a lot of this stuff. So we do the best we can. Also, this is obviously not medical advice, and I'm not telling you to take this to treat your heartburn. So this formula has pomegranate juice, vinegar, and sugar. A lot of sugar. Pomegranate is listed and even seen as natural pharmaceuticals as cold and moist. Energetically, cold and moist therapeutics are the antidote to hot and dry yellow bile. So it purges the heat and dryness of the yellow bile. It's also described as sour. In classical humoral medicine, and this is important, herbs are not generally described by taste the same way they are in modern Western or Chinese herbalism. So the fact that it is described by taste, specifically noted as sour, is important, and we'll get to that in a sec. Not only is pomegranate cold and moist, it's specifically listed as relieving muscle spasms in the digestive system, and also having somewhat of a laxative effect. So it relaxes, cools, and moistens to flush out yellow bile. And it's aided in this by vinegar. Vinegar is also cold and moist and has a drying function. And this may seem a little contradictory. What this means is that vinegar is moist because it's a liquid, but it's also astringent. So it has a drying effect upon the body, in particular mucous membranes and upon fluid substances. So here it's seen as breaking the yellow bile apart to be flushed out, and this kind of corresponds to the modern terms of vinegar dissolving bile salts and promoting gastric emptying. And of course, bile salts here are not yellow bile. Sugar can go a lot of different ways because there are a lot of different kinds of sugar. And by that I mean, in unrefined sugars, we're not just talking about sucrose, fructose, or glucose combinations, but also plant byproducts in the sugar. But here, in this particular formula, mostly what sugar is going to be here for is to protect the mucosal membranes from too much dryness caused by the heat of the yellow bile, and also to protect them against the caustic nature of the vinegar. So we have two cold ingredients, pomegranate and vinegar, and in energetic terms, we know cold means going from a state of more energy to less energy. So cold moves the tissue or organism away from hyperfunction and excitability to a state of reduced function. In terms of modern physiology, the humoral concept of cold would look like something that slows down the nervous system, is anti-inflammatory, antipyretic, maybe antibiotic if that infection comes with local heat and swelling, and not all infections do. Viewed through a Western lens, excess bile acids in the stomach irritate the nerves. They act on TRPV1 receptors, ASIC channels, and vagal nociceptive fibers, and cause sympathetic nervous system overactivation. That's going to look like, in addition to pain, nausea, jitteriness, flushing, and agitation. So, if pomegranate is described as cold and having an affinity for the stomach and intestines and addressing yellow bile, which is a state of heat and excess, it's going to have to put the brakes on all of those things by downregulating, relaxing, and subjectively cooling things off. And it does this potentially through several mechanisms. Punicalagins in pomegranate decrease vagal nociceptive firing. They reduce TRPV1 activation. They stabilize enteric sensory neurons, and they decrease nausea signaling. So in short, they work to reduce nerve irritation. The punicalagins and ellagic acid are also GABA-ergic, meaning they increase, mimic, or enhance GABA. GABA is, of course, the main inhibitory neurotransmitter. And they also reduce neuroinflammation. They also lower gastric inflammatory cytokines, thus treating inflammation in the stomach directly. And they also reduce sympathetic activation. So this means downshifting a nervous system that has been revving up due to bile acid irritation. And all of these mechanisms are what is captured by the description of cold. Ancient humoral physicians obviously didn't know how exactly pomegranate worked in modern terms, but they could chart with fine detail that it did, and also the way in which it did. Now, back to the description of sour. Again, pomegranate is specifically described as sour in the Canon of Medicine, Volume 2, Natural Pharmaceuticals. And flavors, again, were not descriptors or ways of explaining herbal energetics in humoralism. So we know that this is an important distinction for this herb, and it must be special in how it exerts its effect. And this makes sense. Sour flavors act on TRPV1 and TRPA1 receptors and also modulate ASIC channels. And the effect of this is muscle relaxation. It relieves muscle cramping. And this muscle cramping is present in yellow bile, manifesting as abdominal guarding and spasming. And so TRP receptor activation directly relieves this. All right. All of that explanation out of the way, let's go ahead and make this thing. Our instructions are: take 1 pound of sugar, 8 ounces of the juice of pomegranates, and 4 ounces of vinegar. Place them over the fire in a lined vessel and let it boil, constantly stirring with a spatula, until it reaches the thickness of sugar, so that it can be carried in a small box. It is given in the morning with warm water in a dose of 1.5 ounces. So what we are making here is an electuary, and an electuary is a sugar paste. It's not a hard crack candy. For one thing, there's not enough volume or liquid in this, so it would probably reach temperature way too quickly, and then it would burn the bottom. For another thing, the vinegar and the tannins of the pomegranate would likely get in the way of the crystalline candy structure. So that's great news for us, because making hard crack candy is a pain in the ass. And now we don't have to do it. Our recipe says take 1 pound of sugar, 8 ounces of the juice of pomegranates, and 4 ounces of vinegar. Place them over the fire in a lined vessel and let it boil, constantly stirring with a spatula until it reaches the thickness of sugar so that it can be carried in a small box. It is given in the morning with warm water in a dose of 1.5 ounces. So we have our medieval measurements, but medieval measurements are not the same as modern measurements, particularly apothecary measurements. So 1 pound was not 16 ounces, but closer to 12. So maybe not 454 grams, but closer to 350 grams. And for us, the important thing here is that this means the ratio is not 16 to 8 to 4 of sugar to pomegranate to vinegar, but 12 to 8 to 4. In other words, 3 to 2 to 1. So here we have our amounts, and we are just going to go ahead and pour that right into our pot and put it on the stove and bring it to a boil, reduce to a simmer, and then keep stirring. I have the feeling this is going to take a while. I wonder when the last time somebody actually made this recipe was. The Antidotarium is about 900 years old, and it fell out of use gradually, and more so by about the 1500s. So who knows when the last time somebody did this, put this all together was. And it's taking a long time to come to a boil, but that's because we don't want to burn it. So we gradually and continuously just mix this thing back and forth. And it has a really intense smell of vinegar, but definitely some sweet notes in there. Some floral from the pomegranate, and then of course all of the sugar in there. So kind of smells really similar to a chutney. All right, I'm sick of stirring, so we're just gonna let it cook and hope for the best. The recipe says to find a small box to put it in. So here we go. Let's try and follow the recipe as authentically as we can. Although that does not really look like a Middle Ages box. It looks too new. So let's grab a little bit of black walnut and iron stain off the shelf and make it look a little bit more authentic. Here is our black walnut stain, and you can see that it's settled over the years, so we're going to give it a good shake and hope that it doesn't fly all over the place and open up. All right, perfect, nice, deep brown color. All right, let's stain this thing. And really, we're just wasting time here because this is taking forever. At this point in the cooking process, my entire kitchen smells completely like vinegar. Actually, the whole house does. And my dog has left in protest. There we go. Slightly more aged and antiquated looking. All right, so thickening up, it's maybe reduced in size, I don't know, maybe about 40%, but it still has a way to go to become like a paste. I'm guessing this is going to be kind of like a jam, but we'll just have to see. All right, there we have it. Now, hopefully that dries quick and our electuary does not end up tasting like black walnut. Now, I think the bubbles are telling me that we're getting pretty close. I think a lot of the liquid must be evaporated. Those bubbles are concentrating. They're not the big bubbles that you see when you bring water to a boil. They're a lot smaller, so there must be a lot more to hold them in place. So there must be thicker, heavier liquid that can't bubble as much. And that vinegar right in the eyes is really potent. Now, supposedly there's a chilled spoon test that you're supposed to do to check things like jams and sugars you're trying to thicken. I have never gotten this to work, but we'll see anyway. Okay, so, I mean, that is thickening, but I don't really know what I'm looking for here. So I think we're close, but I don't want this to be a syrup. I want this to actually be a paste. So we're gonna let it cook down a little bit more. We're just gonna err on the side of thicker rather than goopy or syrupy. At least try it though. That is actually really good. That is not vinegary at all. It's sour. It is really sour, but it doesn't have like a strong, like, offensive taste you might expect from really cheap red wine vinegar. That's actually really tasty. So this is about how thick we are right now. So let's give it about, I don't know, 20 more minutes or so, and then we'll see how we're doing. Okay, so I lied. This is taking a lot longer than I thought it was going to. Not as thick as I want it to be. So we're going to wait a little while longer. So here's how we're looking. This is the first test we did, and this is the second one. You can see there's a pretty distinct color difference. The first has more of that lighter red pomegranate color, and this is definitely getting darker. This is separated probably about 10 minutes. And this is actually a lot thicker than I thought it was going to be. So that might be what we're looking for. This one is looking pretty good, I think. All right, we don't want a hard lump of sugar, so I think I'm going to stop it right there. Ah, that is actually pretty damn hot. Okay, let's let this chill out for a little bit and see what happens. All right, I think that's good enough. So let's pour that into our box. And this bowl is pretty heavy. You can see there it's, oh, well, now I have pomegranate syrup all over the place. You can see there's a lot clinging to the sides. But that's fine because this box is pretty small, so probably it doesn't hold as much as we want it to anyway. So that's kind of the thickness I think we are going to eventually end up with. This is quite a mess. Even with the parchment paper. So if you're making this at home, the box is probably a really bad idea. Oh my God, is that really stuck in there? And of course, get a spoon. You don't care if it bends or not. Okay, so we may have overcooked this. Now the idea is to be able to wrap this, but I think no matter what we do, it is going to be a huge mess. So, yep, there we go. So don't use a box, is the moral of the story. And that's still a little warm, but I think we can try it anyway. The recipe says to take 1.5 ounces in warm water, and I am not about to measure 1.5 ounces of something this sticky. So we're just gonna kind of, and it's a little warm yet too, so it's gonna kind of take a chunk of it and see if we can, I guess that would be maybe a 1/2 tablespoon. And we have our warm water. All right, I'm just gonna call that good because we're gonna be here all day. So we're trying this Oxysaccharum that we just made. My first impression is that it's actually really tasty. It's really balanced, delicate. It is not overbearingly sour, but it's not cloyingly sweet either. So there's a really nice balance of flavors going on here. And Whether it would help in heartburn, I don't know. But it definitely does increase salivation, and there's a kind of a sense of movement, energetic movement with it too. So I find that all really interesting. So I would be hopeful that this worked, but don't know right now. Well, the wooden box was a terrible idea. So much for historical accuracy. So I put the Oxysaccharum in a jar, and that was also a terrible idea because it became too thick to get out. Apparently, I overcooked it. And now I'm struggling to get it out of the jar so that I can roll it into balls. This is a lot thicker than I thought it was going to be, so I need to go back and figure out how to actually do a cold spoon test. I've never been good at making jams and jellies, and this is probably one of the reasons why. Also, not only is this a little thicker, the color is a little darker, so it seems like it's a little more burned. So hopefully that doesn't change the effect too much. And the next time I do this, I'll have to be much more careful and pull it off of the flame early. Oh my God. Okay.
All right, we're done.
So clearly this isn't hard crack candy, as it's flattened out after about an hour. But I'm going to roll this back into balls and wrap it in parchment paper, and that should hopefully be enough to hold its shape. And here we go, our finished Oxysaccharum. Now, would this formula have treated this patient from the beginning of the video? Well, let's take a look. The symptoms were, I have a very bad stomach and sickness about my heart, and great heat rising up through me, and sweating in my face, and at the butt of the throat, always stifling me, all of the trouble of the world in it, and very bound in the bowels, and a pain in my head, and I does always be inclined to discharge my stomach, and I never can. And I have often gripping and great bast in my lung, and I does be belching up every minute. So let's break his symptoms down. Facial flushing is heat rising, and that heat is going to be due to yellow bile. Sweating in the face is also yellow bile, and that is heat wanting to express outward. The constriction in the back of the throat is interesting here. One might be inclined to think that this is black bile, because black bile is the humor that is most closely associated with the faculty of retention. So it is what causes things to constrict and hold them in place. It's what creates proper muscle tone, and in the stomach, it's what creates the proper muscle tone of the esophageal sphincter so that it can close. But this person clearly has reflux, so the sphincter isn't closed. Plus, there's heat here. There is a ton of heat. There's no cold, and black bile is cold. So in this case, this constriction is likely due to dryness of the tissues from yellow bile. In short, the yellow bile, which is intensely heating, rises in the back of the throat, and the heat pretty much desiccates the muscles and dries them up and makes them really stiff like dried leather. The pain in the head is likely yellow bile ascending from the stomach into the brain. The wish to vomit but can't. This is likely yellow bile being too thick and sticking to the stomach walls. Now, normally if there's a lot of yellow bile in the stomach, it's very irritating and it's caustic, and it will make a person vomit it up. But the yellow bile in this case is likely just too hot, and the excessive heat in the yellow bile has actually dried it out to be too thick to vomit, and now it just kind of hangs out there being irritating and something you just can't get rid of. The belching every minute, that's likely excess yellow bile causing rapid putrefaction in the stomach, and that putrefaction causing off-gassing, which is the burping. Bound stool, in this case, is also likely yellow bile. Now, of course, you could make the argument that this constipation is black bile because black bile is the humor of retention, and so there's lack of movement. But again, there are no cold signs here. So likely this is yellow bile being far too extremely heat, which is causing the whole digestive system to dry out, and the stool is just too dry and hard to pass. The gripping pain in the gut is also yellow bile. And of course, this plus the bound stools confirms the yellow bile has dried things out, because otherwise you would expect to see rapid evacuation of diarrhea. And here you don't. Everything is just too dry and can't move. So this is a pure yellow bile pattern. Simple, but extreme in presentation. Now, theoretically, we could make the case that this is a yellow bile burning black bile pattern. We could make the argument that the headache, the inability to vomit, and the constipation are actually black bile, because again, black bile has the strongest retentive faculty. But in this case, the yellow bile would be burning the black bile and turning it into something caustic, dry and cold on the surface, but with a burned and acrid heat within. And this might be similar in concept to the Chinese medical term phlegm, where phlegm is a mix of cold and heat. It's obviously a yin cold fluid, but it's also thickened mucus. And the thickening of that mucus into phlegm is by virtue of a heat process. So within phlegm, there is implied heat within it. Now, would Oxysaccharum work for this man? Probably not. This guy's symptoms are pretty extreme. Oxysaccharum would likely be for something more transient, less severe with less symptoms of other organ systems. Oxysaccharum would likely treat something that really just is localized to the stomach. So there likely wouldn't be constipation, and if there is dryness of the stools, it probably wouldn't be that bad. Probably not headaches, and probably not fever. So if this person's case is a case of pure yellow bile in excess, while Oxysaccharum does treat yellow bile in excess, it's just not strong enough. He'd probably need something to purge like aloe and other herbs that are much, much colder in nature. And if it's not that at all, if it's a mix of yellow bile and black bile, or a yellow bile becoming black bile, well, then the formula doesn't address the black bile at all. So what would have helped this person? What would an actual potential humoral diagnosis and formula have been as thought of by a medieval physician? That's a really interesting question and an interesting case study. And for all that and more, including different types of heartburn and how they might have been treated, be sure to subscribe to my Substack, Antiquarian Arts, linked below. And if you enjoy this kind of content, these deep dives, case studies, and geek outs into medieval humoral herbalism and medicine, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks.